Isn't open source software just so great? I'm able to create this nice detailed model completely for free, add some nice ABR textures to it, then render it in with path tracing, all for free, no license issues, no cost, no nothing. Seems kind of crazy that such an intricate piece of software is completely free for anyone to use. Even the software I'm recording this with is also open source. OBS, Open Broadcast Software. Where did this come from? Previously it was stuff like Bandicam and Fraps, services you had to pay for or were limited to something like 10 minutes. But I'm able to do all this 4K, make some additional settings, even add noise cancellation and such to the audio without having to pay any sort of service. Where did all this software come from? Open source software is just blowing up, and in this article from 2019, so it's getting quite old now, talks about how it's just been taking over the world, with companies like Red Hat were considered a snowflake, but now they're being acquired by IBM for 32 billion, a company that makes free open source software. This TechCrunch article goes over the business side of open source software and how there is money to be made from it and how it has become very successful. It generally goes over the idea that old software, it was made by businesses and kind of sold or rented out, and generally from developers, it wasn't really that great. And you can see in this section talks about that the top developers of the time didn't believe it was that world class, and that developers would then collaborate asynchronously to offer new pieces of software. OBS is a prime example of software that has become sort of world class, and before it the software quality was questionable. As you can see that it launched in 2012, so 11 years ago now. And before then, YouTube, you remember, would be filled with Bandicam, Hypercam, and Fraps. You had to pay for Fraps, and so if you do want to pay for Fraps, like a lot of people, because it's kind of a lot of money to spend on a piece of software where you may never have seen any return on. So people would use Bandicam where you got 10 minutes, but this Bandicam, you'd have a nice little logo at the top of your video that says Bandicam, and it ruined the quality of the video. It kind of came off as cheap. Others were Hypercam again, which also had a limited amount of time. And so when OBS comes along, you have this open source software with all these great features. The Intel QuickSync, NVIDIA NVENC, so you got great audio and great rendering speeds. The AMD video coding engine, all this great features that were added because it was open source. You could add them, you could make pull requests, make changes, and this piece of software took over the YouTube landscape, the recording landscape. And this software, because it's open source, is cross-compatible. Windows, you can download it for that. Mac OS, download it for that. Linux, you're sorted. It's no wonder this software took over. It's able to support all these platforms and for completely free with all these features. It makes sense that people would want to work with them and people would want to sponsor them. Why pay for Bandicam and use their software and their architecture, which could be limiting, may not even run on your operating system when you can use this. Bandicam to this day still does not support Linux. It's Windows only. You are out of luck if you're OS X or a Linux user. So I couldn't use that. I don't use Windows, so the only way I'd be able to use it would be to emulate it with Proton or something, and God knows what the performance, if it will work, will be like. And Fraps, perhaps the biggest one when it came to YouTube, where majority of the users who paid would buy this piece of software. Now look at it, it's a remnant of the past. The website is old. Last time it was updated was 2013, so over a decade ago, and the cost of it was $37. Not something I would be paying for today in a piece of software that hasn't been updated for 10 years. You wouldn't really get this with open source software, because if a team of leaders had left the project or just one, someone could just come on and pick up the mantle. The code is there, and they say, you know what, I'm going to be the new leader and maintainer of this, and I'll do that. We're not the only ones that are also using open source software. Businesses are also using it a lot, and from this report from gitnux from 2024, which covers the 2023 data, we can get some nice highlights. So 78% of businesses are using open source software according to their research. 70% of devs said that working on open source software projects helped improve their skills. 90% of developers rely on open source components in their proprietary. 90%. So that would be kind of like when you download a package from Python. they would be a component. It's not like you're downloading a big piece of software, but you're using a sort of little chunk of code that is open source that anyone can edit and change. 96% of applicants have at least one open source component. I even think that the 4% must be using some. It's everywhere nowadays when it comes to programming and other development needs. Open source maintains a 30% lower organizational cost, which is a big one for businesses. Cutting costs is great. 80% of the software code is used in modern applications has got open source software in. 30 million open source projects hosted on the GitHub platform. And GitHub plus other hosting sites like GitLab have made a huge impact, which we'll go into later. 1 in 5 open source services application has a critical security and vulnerability, which is obviously not great, but because it is open, those vulnerabilities can be patched out as they can be seen by everyone. And in 2020, 58% of users that said they chose open source because it's easy of implementation. It's great to search up an issue and other people have that issue and you can look in the code and see where it's going wrong. As opposed to closed source software, you have to go to the customer support and hope that they know the solution. It can be quite a long process. Only 21% of open source maintainers are paid for their work. It just shows you how generous people are, that they contribute their free time to maintain or update or patch a piece of software where they basically receive no gain for it. And then when it comes to the money, 50 billion by 2026 they expect. A lot of money around free software. And 61% of businesses contribute back to open source projects, so companies are contributing to it now. You wouldn't have seen that a decade or two ago. It would have been far less common. Open source developers spend an average of 20% of their time debugging code, which is a pretty interesting tidbit there. And I agree with this statement made by the research. 78% of businesses are using open source software, the most important statistic. This is big because it means businesses want to use it and they like using it. Powerful testament of the growing popularity of open source software. Shows that the majority of businesses are recognizing the value of the open source software and are taking advantage of its many benefits. In a lot of cases, outweighs proprietary software. Proprietary software, you don't know any of the security vulnerabilities, and there's been times of data breaches because of it. When if they use an open source software, they could have those issues patched out quicker because of the public community all having their eyes watching the code. Its other important statistic was over 70% said that working on open source software projects helped improve their skills. And that is true because there's no better example than with what happened when they didn't use open source software or some sort of open software is Halo Infinite. A year or two ago, this game suffered many development problems. Not only was the game delayed by a year, but once it did come out, its content was seriously lacking. Updates became very infrequent, tons of issues with the live service mechanics, the leveling up system, features that you would expect in a Halo game were just not there. And it kind of turned out, and especially from our favorite reporter Jason Schreier, said that a chunk of biggest development problems was labor. A large chunk of 343 workers were on contracts and couldn't stay longer than 18 months due to Microsoft restrictions. And then full-time promotions were so rare. So not only were, once the game came out, that they lost these developers that had worked on the game, and they couldn't keep updating it. But Halo Infinite ran on their own engine. It was like the Slip Space engine. It wasn't using any open source engine, or it wasn't Unreal, it wasn't Godot, it wasn't Unity. And there is benefit to using proprietary engines, but when it came to this one, it became a serious flaw. When hiring developers and you have your own proprietary software, well, you're gonna have to train them. They can't use it. There's no way to access it. Unlike Unreal Engine, you can hire developers like, yeah, I'm familiar with Unreal Engine, I've used it loads, or on Unity or Godot. With this, they're gonna have no idea, and adding new features is going to be very difficult. And this is supposedly what has happened with Halo Infinite. When in its development days, people were not familiar with the engine and were still trying to get a hang of it. And not only that, they had to add features on their own. Unlike Unreal, which is full of features and people can add their own features from the asset pack, or Godot, where they can make requests of features to add, they would have had to done this all themselves. And obviously they tried to contract and outsource work, delayed a lot of the content to be added. And big core features, split screen co-op, was cancelled. At the time, the head said, but after Halo 5 had released, or 4, they said, oh, we're going to include co-op on every game after, and they failed to deliver on this promise. Had they used other open source software, or they may have not had these issues. The developers would have been easier to acquire, people would have been far more familiar with the code. And while with stuff like Unreal Engine and Unity there is a fee, Unreal it's usually 5% after a certain amount of money. I'd argue that 5% is worth it, because you still have to make an engine, so you still need a software engineer, a team to work on the game engine. You can't just hire people to specifically work on a game. You need a team that will also develop the engine alongside the game, and this has caused issues for not just Halo Infinite but also other developers. Cyberpunk had huge issues using their own engine once again, the Red engine. This is possibly what caused a lot of issues, and also their development kind of cycle was pretty bad. They went from working with high-end hardware, then trying to optimize it for low-end hardware, and a lot of the kind of theories is that because it was using this proprietary engine, they had to add features alongside the game. So if they wanted to add the shooting mechanics, because the Red engine was for the Witcher game, which has no shooting and is very sword-based combat and in third person, they had to add all these features to it, and this requires a lot of experience. They did in fact get government funding from Poland for their facial animations, which is done up very good. The facial animations are fantastic in that game, and obviously now we look at it, the game is great, but it just shows the difficulties of trying to use your own engine. It can be a real detriment to development. This game was first announced like 2013. It was in development for 18 years technically, and for the game to come out, it kind of felt like this is 18 years long worth of development. And it just shows, really, if you think about it, probably really split up into 4 years worth of updating the engine to work with the game, and then the 4 years is spent developing the game, and their whole development life cycle was all in whack. And now they've made the announcement a while ago that they're getting rid of this engine. They're not going to do it. It's all going to be done in Unreal now. Why save the hassle of the 5% return of money when that 5%, if not more, is just going to go into developing the engine? 8 years. You could possibly just spend 4 years just because you're not having to spend time developing your own software, your own engine. GitHub has been a huge contributor into open source software becoming so popular. If you think about it, this software has to be hosted somewhere, and if you're making software to be used freely, you might not be too fond of trying to pay money for a hosting service provider. And how other people are going to contribute to the project unless you're hosting a whole Git repository yourself on your own website and service? It's not going to be cheap. And so when GitHub came around in 2008, it's just grown exponentially, especially when Microsoft bought it and able to support it. It is huge. 372 million repositories are on GitHub. This has resulted in just an absolute change in the way software is designed and why open source software has become so prominent. Without this, we'd probably still be using a lot of proprietary software because people have got to make their money return back. And despite Microsoft acquiring it and despite having paid versions, GitHub still promotes open source software. While you might have 500 megabytes of package storage, if your project is open source and free for the public, then you get essentially unlimited. It encourages it. Again, free for public repositories. You get this minutes a month. You just have to create an account and you're ready. And even if you don't like that, there's other projects like GitLab. And if you don't have your own repositories, then you are obviously completely free just to contribute to existing repositories. When we looked at using a local Armor, GitHub was where the code was stored. README and all here, it's just easily nice and manageable. All the pull requests, you can see what people are contributing. You can go into the issues to find what people are talking about. It's, hey, I've got this issue, and they will tell you, here's this fix. And when we were installing this local Armor, we did have an issue, and we found someone else who had that issue, and within that discussion told us, this is how you fix it. You wouldn't get this with closed software. You'd have to go to customer support and hope that they know the solution. It can be time consuming and you could be wasting your time, especially if you're just stuck not able to use the software. So why would a business want to make open source software as opposed to their own proprietary software that they could sell and make a profit from? Well, if you look at Google and their Chrome browser, as you can see, they have a huge market dominance share of 64%. But what's interesting about this is both Edge and Opera are Chromium-based browsers, and other Chromium-based browsers are like Brave, for example. So they're actually just Chrome, but with a different skin on. The only unique one is Firefox and Safari that have their own type of backend code. Since Google owns Chromium and the code base, despite it being open source, they can decide what they want to pull and what changes they want to make. Therefore, they can make favorable features that benefits Google in the long run. As we've seen, adblock's been a problem to Google, and they want to remove it from YouTube so that ads always appear. And they've been looking at ways that they just implement features on Chromium where adblock becomes non-functional. And because other browsers are dependent on Chromium, if they pull those features, those browsers are also affected. The only ones that are not affected are Firefox. As we can see, Firefox is having a significantly smaller share of the internet browser space, only 3.36. Epic Games has been doing the mega grants where you can receive funding to your projects that kind of benefit Unreal Engine in a sense. And the reason that they might want to put a grant to an open source project is because maybe it will take away a monopoly of an existing proprietary software. This means Epic Games don't have to conform to whatever standard that may be set. Back in 2020, Armorpain received a mega grant to fund their essentially alternative to Substance Painter, and this is free to use, but you can pay for a pre-built version of the code, so you don't have to compile it. But this means that if said software is popular and people download it, people aren't dependent on Substance Painter, they can still use this, and that means therefore they can still create stuff for the Unreal Engine. Some companies are sort of just generous, they like to see open source code be contributed to, or in other cases it's to kind of help with other developers. Unity has been pushing license changes that negatively impact developers, possibly resulting in actually debt, as in they were having to repay more than they were earning. They did revert these changes, but it did make companies start funding other projects because they don't want other businesses to conform and they want other options. Terraria and such, these developers maybe rely on these proprietary software, and having good quality open source software means that in the future their businesses is not effective. If, for example, I was a developer and I always use Unity, and Unity didn't start enforcing these changes and there was no alternative, I would have to possibly close down my studio or just submit to the changes or make huge financial changes into the business. But because there are open source software, I can revert to those changes if I wanted to. Another example where a company would want to use open source has been Valve. Valve has been very heavy on being cross-platform among every different device. Linux, OS X and Windows, you can all download Steam and download games that support it, but their big software development push has been with Linux specifically, and releasing the Proton kind of emulation-like layer. And this has resulted in them eventually releasing the Steam Deck, which was after essentially many years of developing this Proton software where you could run Windows games within Linux almost natively, even in some cases better FPS thanks to some little tricks. They finally released this handheld device that is just excellent. Currently you can get the lowest one for £309 in the UK. It's such a steal for a device, and they would not be able to sell this device at such a good deal if the software wasn't open source. If they were using Windows like other competitors are, they would have to pay for the license. They also wouldn't have as much control and granularity as they would with their own operating system. In this case, it's running SteamOS, which is again, thanks to open source software, a fork of Arch Linux / Manjaro Linux, and they've included their Proton and have worked with previously with Lutris, another kind of open source Linux way of playing video games. They've worked with them, and it's just resulted in this device that is able to play games anywhere at such a good deal. There are still areas that are weak and lack good alternatives. I think image editing and vector design related work is still lacking. There are good alternatives, but they just don't stand up against stuff like Adobe Photoshop, Affinity Designer or Procreate. GIMP is pretty good, Krita is also great, but they're not as they lack really some of the more complex features. And stuff like Inkscape is one of them, is that it's CPU bound. It doesn't use the graphics card to help accelerate some of the calculations. Schreicher is definitely the one that's becoming one of the most popular ones. It's open source. It has great features. You can actually get it on Steam as well, but I believe the Steam version is a bit out of date. But it's still, when I compare it to Affinity Designer, which I've used before, it's still very far behind. Infinity is superb. It's a single price, but it's exclusive to Windows and OS X, and it kind of goes with a lot of other image editing software where they're either paid for by subscription or they don't even run on your operating system. Another area is with video editing. Open source software for video editing is kind of just lacking. They're just not as good as DaVinci Resolve or anything that Adobe has, like After Effects or Premiere. While they're functional and good, they just might not have some of the latest features like AI integration, and in general there's just nothing really wrong with paid for software. I think the features that they've found and researched in paid for have kind of trickled down to open source. They looked at it and think this is a nice feature that people like. Why don't we include that in our piece of software in our own way? I think Affinity, for example, is a great piece of software. You buy it one purchase. The only issue is that it's limited to Windows and Mac OS X. Unfortunately, no Linux support, as because it is very reliant on DirectX, and they've expressed that they don't have any interest currently porting to Linux, which sort of makes sense because the user base on Linux is probably quite small, but I would really like to see it. TechCrunch back in 2015 said that, is this the golden age of open source software? Has it arrived? And I would say that we are in one. I think really the breaking point was in 2019 once Blender 2.8 came in. I think that piece of software, when they completely overhauled the UI and made it feel like a paid for software, was that almost like turning point that open source software isn't just like a free crappy alternative that you get like, oh, I don't want to pay, or I don't have the money for this paid for software, I'm just gonna use this one, it works. But Blender really showed that open source software can go above and beyond that. After that time, we've been seeing so many great pieces of software. Godot, Critter of that video editing with Shotcut, they've just been really superb and they're becoming more refined. So what's your opinion about open source software? Do you think we're in a golden age, or do you think we're going to see a decline in it? Do you use it, or do you just pay for the software that you like? Comment down below and like and subscribe to more computer science and research and programming related stuff.